We'd like to turn to the book of 1 Samuel. Today, of course, is what is known in the United States as Mother's Day, and contrary to popular belief, Mother's Day was not conceived in the boardroom of Hallmark. The earliest public tribute to mothers dates back to the annual spring festival when the Greeks dedicated to their goddess Rhea, the mother of many deities, and also to the ancient Romans who offered sacrifices to their mother of gods. So-called Christianity celebrated this festival on the fourth Sunday of Lent in honor of Mary. Eventually, in England, it was expanded to include all mothers, not just Mary, and was called Mothering Sunday. As far as the United States is concerned, a woman by the name of Anna Reeves Jarvis was really the power behind the official establishment of Mother's Day in the United States. Upon the death of her mother in 1905, she began a campaign to memorialize her mother and mothers. In 1907, she passed out white carnations at her mother's church in Grafton, West Virginia. Upon her request, on May 10, 1908, they had a Sunday service honoring mothers, and a campaign began for an official Mother's Day. By 1909, Mother's Day services were held in 46 states, and in 1912, West Virginia became the first state to adopt an official Mother's Day. And in 1914, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution signed by Woodrow Wilson establishing Mother's Day as an official holiday. Anna Reeves Johnson became increasingly concerned over the commercialization of Mother's Day and got a little cranky and said, "I wanted it to be a day of sentiment, not profit, and greeting cards is just a poor excuse for the letters you're too lazy to write," is what she said. It's not what I said. It's what she said. But please do not misunderstand me, what I'm about to say. It's not my intent to put a damper on the occasion, but I do wish that Mother's Day and Father's Day did not fall on the Lord's Day. We don't need any more distractions than we already have for the Lord's Day. Having said that, being Mother's Day, we feel led to bring a message associated with the occasion. I do think we need to, this is true of any holiday, but we need to be aware that Mother's Day, just like any day that's been set apart, though it's a time of happiness and precious memories for most, to others it can be a time of great sorrow. It can be a very painful reminder. We need to be aware of that. Mother's Day can be a difficult day for some. It can be a difficult day for those who have recently experienced the death of a mother. It's a difficult day. For those who have bad memories of their mothers. It could be a painful day. For those mothers who were not what they should be and have guilt feelings about their own motherhood, it can be a very painful day for them. Those who have serious problems with their children and will not hear from their children, it can be a very painful day. Those who are experiencing empty nest syndrome, which I've never understood, but I'm not a woman. That could be a very painful day. Those who have marital problems, it can be a painful day. For those who have experienced the death of a child, it can be a very painful day. For those who were never able to have children, it could be a very painful day. For those who have difficulty having children, they have no children, they have difficulty having children. It can be a very painful day. So what I'm saying is, though it may be a happy occasion for you or for most, pray for those for whom it may not be. And try to be sensitive to that. I thank God for my mother. I think about her every single day. I have her picture on my phone. It's the first thing I see when I get up in the morning. I think about her every day, and I miss her. And when I look at Mother's Day's cards, I thank the Lord for her. I thank the Lord for the precious memories that I have. And there's a degree of hurt and emptiness. Mother's Day is a day set apart to honor, to show appreciation and love for our mothers. I do want to say that being a mother is more than giving birth and having children. There are women who have children, but that doesn't make them a mother. So there is a difference. There is such a thing as biblical womanhood, biblical motherhood. And we thank God for each mother that is here that fills that role. And we say thank you. Thank you for filling that role. The Bible has preserved the memory of many godly, influential women and many godly, influential mothers. Women of influence. Women of impact, especially upon those whom they loved. And the Bible, by preserving the memory of these women and mothers, provide an example to all women everywhere. And also provides an example for all of us, whether male or female. So we want to read here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We'll read verse 2 and then we'll read verses 20 through 28. And he, Elkanah, had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Then over in verse 20, through the end of the chapter. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. And the man Elkanah and his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah, her husband, said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good. Tarry until thou hast weaned him, a period of 2 to 3 years. Only the Lord established his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young, 2 to 3 years old. And they slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli, who was the priest. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. Here we read of a godly woman, a godly mother. The whole world is influenced by such. One cannot overestimate the sway which a godly mother holds. There's a lot of truth to that old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. There's a lot of truth to that. You cannot overestimate the importance, you cannot overestimate the impact of godly women, godly mothers upon a nation, upon a society, upon homes, upon churches, upon individual lives. And in a day of negative press against biblical womanhood and biblical motherhood, the Bible gives her a place of honor, a place of esteem, a place of priority. The Bible exalts family and lifts up the place of women in the family. And when women try to usurp their God-ordained place, they degrade themselves. They always do. The subject of the message is a portrait of a godly woman and mother. Let's consider, first of all, some background to what we've just read. It goes back to chapter 1, verse 1, where we're introduced to Hannah's husband. And then it continues through verse 21 of chapter 2. But for the sake of time, we have limited our reading to our text verses. Now, what is the time frame of this text? Well, it would be set in the distressing context of the book of Judges. And such gives a picture of the spiritual climate that existed, has background for the verses we just read. Eli, who was a priest, was also a judge, one of the judges, and approximately for 40 years. He's mentioned there in verse 3, verse 9, verse 12, verse 13, verse 14, 17, and 25. So he is a prominent individual. By reading the book of Judges, we get a picture of the moral climate of the day. And it's very much like the moral and spiritual climate of our day. There was a lack of revelation. We read in 1 Samuel 3:1, there was no open vision. There was no open proclamation of God's word. People were so sinful that God was silent. Similar to what we read in Romans chapter 1. It was a time when there was a lack of restraint. We read in Judges 21:25, in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. No prophet preaching, no moral absolutes, but rather situational ethics. You do your own thing. If it feels good, if you think it's good, it's okay. It was a time when there was a lack of respect for the Lord. We read in 1 Samuel 2, verse 17, "For men abhorred the offering of the Lord." So the setting of what is before us is one of terrible and devastating spiritual decline and degeneracy, a national departure from God. Rebellion, waywardness, faithlessness, permissiveness, immorality, idolatry was the norm of the day. It was a time of miserable spiritual failure. The book of Judges opens up with miserable spiritual failure. It was a time of great turmoil. It was a time of great confusion. The nation was in a crisis. Everything was bleak. The time frame of what we've read was a tragic hour in the history of Israel. And in that, we're introduced to a family. We're introduced to a Jewish family. Here in 1 Samuel 1, our attention is drawn to this family, but more importantly to a godly woman and mother in that family by the name of Hannah. We read in verse 1 of her husband. We learn from verse 1 that he was from the hill country of Ephraim, which is about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. We're told in verse 2 that he had 2 wives. And though he was justified by the customs of his day, he was in violation of God's institution of the law of marriage. That, of course, was common in the Old Testament. Don't ever think that a plurality of wives in the Old Testament was okay. It was against God's institution of the law of marriage. God's pattern is one man, one woman, till death do us part. That's God's pattern. From verse 2, we see that one of the wives was Hannah and the other Peninnah. And there were the children of Peninnah, but we read, but Hannah had no children. And that, of course, sets the stage for the account that we've read. We read in verse 5 that Elkanah loved Hannah. He loved her. But the Lord had shut up her womb. And that perhaps explains why he had a second wife. Didn't make it right. And the fact that the Lord had shut up her womb is repeated again in verse 6. Now, Peninnah was jealous of Hannah, and from verse 6 we see that she became her adversary. We read in verse 6 that she provoked, that is, she irritated and insulted and annoyed Hannah sore, that is, very severely and hurtfully. 2, she did this on purpose and with purpose to make her fret, to make her miserable. So the one wife sets out to make the other wife miserable. We read in verse 7, she provoked her, therefore she wept and did not eat. She was continually taunted. Hannah was a woman with many afflictions, provocation, cruelty, Ridicule was a part of her everyday life. We read in verse 10 that she was in bitterness. What that means is she was in an irreconcilable state of soul. But in spite of the times in which she lived, in spite of her adverse circumstances, Hannah serves as a godly example and a godly inspiration, not only to women, but to all of us. She's an example and an illustration of a woman, of a mother, and as a child of God. God was going to use Samuel, which would be her firstborn son. God was going to use Samuel in a great way. But the book does not begin with Samuel. The book begins with Hannah, his mother. That's where it begins. So let's look at some characteristics of Hannah, because I believe you see a profile of a godly woman. May I say, you cannot be a godly mother if you are not a godly woman. And again, she serves as an example. She serves as an inspiration to all of us. The first thing was that she was a woman of grace. Her very name means favor or grace. On the other hand, Peninnah means pearl, signifying beauty. So she was probably a beautiful woman. But Hannah, God's favor, God's grace. The meaning of her name would serve as a reminder that she was an object of God's favor. And this not because of anything in her. Her name would serve as a reminder of where her help came from and of her need. Her name would remind her that what she needed was not more ability, but God's help. That's what she needed. Her name would remind her that she needed God's intervention in her life. Her circumstances, verse 2, but Hannah had no children. And in verse 5 and 6, the Lord shut up her womb. Now, infertility in the Old Testament was a shame. It was a disgrace. It was looked upon as a failure. So Hannah was a marked woman by society, an outcast in some degree, but an object of God's grace. And that would override her adverse times and her adverse circumstances. Her name would remind her, God sees you, Hannah, in favor. Her very name would remind her of that. Hannah was a testimony of God's great grace. She displayed the grace of God in her life. She was a picture of the grace of God. You and I are to be a testimony. We're to be a display. We're to be a picture of the grace of God. The grace of God always makes a difference. In Hannah, you could see she was different. There was a very marked difference in her. In this day, when many who profess an experience of grace and merely want to fit in with the world by adopting their lifestyles and so on, we need men, we need women We need boys and girls who want their lives to display and manifest God's grace. And I believe Hannah was just that. We see, being a testimony of God's grace, it greatly grieved Hannah to be thought of anything less than such. In verse 13 and 14, when Eli the priest saw her lips silently moving and tears streaming down her face, he immediately made the assumption that she was drunk, and he began to rebuke her. And Hannah's response in verse 15 and 16 was, "No, my Lord, count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial." Hannah is saying, don't think of me that way. That's not who I am. She is saying, I respect the holiness of God. I'm not like the daughters of Belial. It was a day of a lack of revelation, a lack of restraint. And there's Hannah, the picture of God's grace. And we thank God for women and mothers of grace. Secondly, she was a woman of prayer. Living in a difficult time, a difficult situation. She was in much distress and anguish of soul. She had much disappointment and frustration. She was grieved and of a sorrowful spirit, and she was burdened and she was weighted down. And we're told in verse 7 that her husband and his wives went up to the house of the Lord. And while Peninnah ate of the sacrificial portions that Elkanah gave her, Hannah would not eat. And in verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, attempted to comfort her. And in verse 9, Hannah rose up. And in verse 10, we read that though in bitterness of soul, she prayed unto the Lord. She turned to the Lord for help. She turned to the Lord for strength. She was praying with a desire for the blessings of God. She was not merely going through the motions of prayer, the mechanics of prayer. It was no ordinary prayer. We see in verse 10 that she prayed weeping. We see in verse 11 she prayed specifically for a son. She was single-minded in her prayer. And in verse 12 we read that she continued praying. She prayed with persistence. And in verse 13, she spake in her heart. So it was a heartfelt prayer, a prayer that came from her heart. In verse 15, Hannah says that I poured out my soul before the Lord. So she was praying earnestly and fervently. Her prayer was marked by passion. Her prayer was marked by zeal. Her prayer was marked by intensity and great energy and great yearning of heart and soul. And then from verse 16, she was praying out of the abundance of what she was feeling within. She's filled with distress, and she empties her distress unto the Lord. She is filled with anguish, and she empties her anguish unto the Lord. She's filled with hurt, and she empties her hurt unto the Lord. She's filled with sorrow, and she empties her sorrow unto the Lord. She has burdens, and she empties her burdens unto the Lord. She's filled with desires, and she empties her desires unto the Lord. She lays everything out before the Lord. What an example of a praying spirit for all of us. But oh, how we ought to thank God for women and mothers of prayer. Never underestimate that. Never underestimate the prayers of a mother. The continued prayers of a mother. Hannah was praying for Samuel before he was even born. Thirdly, she was a woman of faith. She had no children. In a sense, she's suffering from what she did not have, so what did she do? She laid hold of what she did have. God. Don't get stuck in what you don't have. Lay hold of what you do have. God. Notice verse 11. She addresses the Lord as the Lord of hosts. That states her faith. She believed that He was in control of all. She poured out her soul believing that God was able. She poured out her soul believing that God could do the impossible. She knew. She was certain that the God who placed the sun, the moon, the stars by speaking, that He was an able God, and that this God could give her that son. Oh, how we need to be a people, regardless of times and circumstances, confident in God. Amen. And we thank God for women and mothers of faith who are confident in God. Fourthly, Hannah was a woman who acknowledged the goodness of God. In verse 20, Hannah conceived and bare a son, and all the joy that filled her heart. And we read that she called his name Samuel. You know what Samuel's name means? It means God heard. God heard. So when that little boy was born, she said, I want to call him Samuel. God has heard. She is acknowledging the goodness of God. She's acknowledging that this child is a miracle of God, that it was of God. And in verse 27, she declared to Eli, for this child I prayed. And thank God for the mom that prayed for you before you were born. And thank God for the mom that upheld you in prayer. And thank God for the mom that continues to pray for you. That is a godly mother. Fifthly, she was a woman of love. She was a woman of commitment. In verse 11, in her prayer for a son, she vowed a vow, saying, I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. Lord, if you would grant me a son, I will give him unto you all the days of his life. After her request for a son was graciously granted, she did not forget the commitment that she had made unto the Lord. Oh, how many have forgotten the commitments that they have made unto God. In verse 21, her husband and the others go up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice. In verse 22, but Hannah went not up. For she said unto her husband, I will go up when the child is weaned. Again, a period of 2 to 3 years. But notice, I will bring him that he may appear before the Lord and abide forever. That is, he will serve God. I will let go of him, and he'll serve the Lord. See that after he was weaned, she took him up with her. 2 to 3 years, and she never forgot her commitment to God. Through those 2 to 3 years of weaning, many things happened. Her love, her attachment for Samuel no doubt grew in that time. And she remained steadfast in her commitment. I'm going to give him unto the Lord for his entire life. And then after 2 or 3 years, without any hesitation, without any attempt to avoid the commitment, she took her journey to the house of God. And on that journey, she remained steadfast in her commitment to God. Thank God for women, mothers, who remain steadfast in their commitment to God. The best thing you can do for your child is to be committed to God. Hannah had a vital and personal relationship with God, and nothing removed that from her. She did not forget her commitment that she made to God, and we thank God for moms that remain committed in giving us to God. Give your children to God. Give your children to God. Well, I don't want my son being a preacher. Give your son to God, and you leave that with him. Hannah was a woman of sacrifice. When she arrived at the house of God with her son Samuel, she said to Eli the priest, in verse 26, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child, she's holding Samuel, for this child I prayed, and the Lord gave me my petition which I asked of him. And then verse 28, therefore, because the Lord hath given him to me, the Lord hath given him to me, because of that, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. Her heart is surrendered to God. She realizes that God has given to her so that she can give back to God. That's a lesson for all of us. Whatever it is that God has given to us, it is so that we can give back to God. She realizes that he's worthy of all, and she lets go. She lets go. Thank God for the sacrifice of moms. Seventhly, and lastly, Hannah was a woman of worship. To worship is to draw near to God. It's to bow down in homage to him. It's to reverence him. It's to exalt him. It's to love him, to thank him, to praise him. She worshiped God. When she came to the tabernacle to pour out her soul to God, she worshiped God. She worshiped God at the birth of Samuel, recognizing that it was of God. She worshiped God while she was weaning, the child Samuel, all along remaining committed to her vow to the Lord. She worshiped God when she gave her son to the Lord. She had a vivid realization of the presence of God. She had a vivid realization of who God was. A vivid realization of what God had done in her life. And we need to be a people of worship. And we thank God for women and mothers of worship. We thank God for women with the characteristics of Hannah, a godly woman, a godly mother. And all through the Bible, women and mothers are given an exalted position. Motherhood has a very special place. It's a very high priority in the Word of God. Motherhood is a special privilege. It is a sacred duty. Not all fulfill that duty, but some do. And we thank God. Motherhood is a God-given ministry to your own children. And it's to be viewed as such. Embrace your God-given role as a woman. Embrace your God-given role. And men, honor that role. Honor that role. Respect that role. 1 Peter 3, verse 7, women are described as the weaker vessel. Not the inferior vessel. Nowhere is she described as the inferior vessel. Just the weaker vessel. The truth is, she's superior to man when it comes to some of the more noble qualities of character, such as unselfishness. Again, you can't just make a blanket statement. But overall, women are more unselfish than men. They have the ability to minister to the suffering, and their love and their compassion usually excels that of men. As the weaker vessel, their husbands have a responsibility, and that is to dwell with them according to knowledge. Giving, present tense, ongoing, honor. Giving honor unto his wife as the weaker vessel. So he is to respect her, to esteem her, to admire her, to recognize and to regard her, and to show devotion to her as the weaker vessel. Her being the weaker vessel puts a great responsibility upon the man. And any woman that takes offense at being the weaker vessel, you just don't understand. What an exalted position and the responsibility that your husband has towards you because you are the weaker vessel. What a calling that God has given to women Embrace that calling. And men, honor women. Honor them. Show them respect. The world desperately needs the godly influence of women with the heart of a mother. And we thank God for our women. We thank God for godly mothers. Brother John, if you'd come and lead us